Next on our tour of devastated countries after the war is France. And excuse me, France is where the center of the art world had been prior to World War II, and then it experienced cataclysmic destruction at the hands of the Germans, and it altered France's position in the art world, and that's when it went to New York, and we had the reign of the abstract expressionists. However, there's some very interesting things going on in France immediately after the war. The first group that we'll look at is a group known as kind of artists that were influenced by existentialism. And they weren't a group of people that hung out. They weren't like the abstract expressionists. They didn't have a club where they met and talked about philosophy or anything like that. These are all just individual artists whose work seems to embody this idea of existentialism. So we'll talk about what existentialism is, and just realize that these artists that I've listed here are not a group. That's it's not really a movement. It's just people influenced by a philosophy, or in some cases, the people themselves deny that they're existentialists, but their work itself seems very existential. And then there's a group known as Tachisme, which is weird to say in English. Sometimes they're referred to as lyrical abstraction artists, which is also kind of a weird phraseology in English too. But anyway, they're ones who will be influenced by abstract expressionism. Some people say that they were influenced to a great degree, others that they weren't influenced at all. There's probably somewhere in the middle of that duality, but they are artists who embraced this form of abstraction after the war, about 1948 to about 1970. They were a little bit more of a group. They were aware of each other. They exhibited their work together than the artists that were involved with existentialism. So let's look and see. Before World War II began in Europe, there were two prevailing styles that were dominant in France. The first is Surrealism, probably the most famous of them because it's so weird and fun. And both sculpturally and in painting, you have things that evoke visceral memories of the unconscious. You have things that creep you out. There's this sense of unease about the things that are created and or depicted in their style. It's all about dream imagery. It's all about plumbing the unconscious mind for strange symbols. And the other style was completely different. It was geometric abstraction. It was works like these, where you, as the viewer, are just kind of distant from this. There's no emotional involvement. You appreciate the forms, you like the composition, and it's more of a cerebral appreciation of such things. And then Hitler happened, and then France became ground zero for the American invasion when they entered the war years later. And so France suffered, again, just devastating destruction during this time period. And this is what it ended up looking like after the war. Occasionally, you'll see some color photographs from World War II that makes it even seem even almost more surreal because we're used to thinking of World War II photographs being only in black and white, but there was some color photographs being taken, and these are again post-war France and just the everyday wreckage to everyday towns. People had to completely rebuild their lives in the wake of this destruction. And in addition, one of the problems with France is that France had been occupied by the Nazis, and there were certain French people that went along with the occupation that after the war were viewed as traitors to the French cause, even though people might have felt they had no choice but to get along with the Germans and to do what the Germans forced them to do. After the war, there was a whole reconciliation process that had to be gone through for the French as they had to come to terms with the fact that so many of their citizens had basically rolled over for the Germans. Existentialism itself wasn't new. It had been around since the 19th century, But after the devastation of two world wars now, it really grabbed a hold of people's consciousness after the second one. And so some of the basic ideas of existentialism as they were understood widely is that existence before essence is kind of like the key phrase associated with existentialism. Existence is in the title after all. And it basically means that you have your existence right now. And this idea of a soul and this idea of a heaven, a hell, a higher power is just all made up. That there's no higher purpose to your being. You're not here to fulfill any great design. It's just you and the world. There's no God, there's no supreme being. And, as I stayed here in this little brief explanation, you have nothing. There is nothing. You have to confront this and you have to just accept it. Your experience is your experience of the world, and you can't expect anybody else's experience of the world to be similar, to be the same. You've only got your own subjective life. Have you ever just sat and been like, oh my God, I'm alive. I'm a person. I'm a person at this moment. And nobody else can be in my head and be in my thoughts. This sense of yourself as this concrete being. That's kind of part of this. But then you realize as you look to the universe and you look to history and the ways that humans have constructed their reality, it's just that. It's a constructed reality. And it's designed to limit you in order to hem you in and to not allow you your freedoms. Things like religion and morality. Think about secular laws. How many secular laws are based upon religious law? Thou shalt not kill. You're not supposed to steal. Things like that. Who says? God. God says. The state of Connecticut says. All of these things are just designed to keep you behaving, and of course some of them are good, right? You don't want people running around killing everybody just because they're upset by something. But once you realize that there is no higher truth behind these things, then you feel alienated. You feel alienated from your government, you feel alienated from the church, you feel alienated from your fellow human, and you feel alone and estranged. And the only way that you can get past this despair, this anxiety, this alienation, is to embrace your existence, to live in the moment, to, be like a dog, always living for this one moment. And only this can lead you to freedom. Only this will set you free. And it's heavy. But then on the other side of that heaviness is supposedly freedom. It's hard to do. It's hard to give up all these things that we cling to. Patriotism. I live in a great country. Do you live in a great country? Or is this just something you've been told since 5 minutes after you were born and you don't question it? More than any other country after the war, France seemed to embrace this philosophy in a big way. And it produced some really fantastic writers after the war who were attracted to existentialism and who embraced it and who continued to explore it, whether in philosophical texts or through the venue of fiction. Jean-Paul Sartre is one of these philosophers who also wrote fiction in which he kind of dramatized what it's like to embrace this philosophy of existentialism, and he became something of a celebrity in post-war France. One thing that's great about Sartre's existentialism for art history is that he often used examples like art or involved in art. Here are some bullet points about him from direct quotes from him. He's the one who popularized this idea of existence precedes essence as kind of the the main way to understand existentialism. But I like the second bullet point here. In life, a man commits himself, draws his own portrait, and there is nothing but that portrait. So it's this, idea of you being trapped in your subjectivity. Like this is what you have. You have yourself drawing your own portrait, creating yourself, and there's nothing but your portrait. That's all you have. That's all you can depend on. And then speaking about the German occupation, he talks about every thought was a conquest. As an all-powerful police sought to silence us, each word became as precious as a declaration of principle. As we were pursued, each gesture had the weight of an engagement. So what you did in the moment, the word you spoke, the gesture you made, took on the weight of a great thing, of an important thing, because that's all you had in that moment, and you literally embodied it under great peril. He also uses painting as a metaphor for moral choice. He says that it's like the construction of a work of art. As everyone knows, there's no predefined picture for him to make. The picture that ought to be made is precisely that which he will have made. As everyone knows, there are no aesthetic values a priori, that's before, but there are values which will appear in due course. In other words, it's existence that creates your values, not only aesthetic values, but your values as a human being. That you are not born with these inherent values that are like plopped into your brain, but it is in the course of your lifetime. Just as a painter, you might think that you have an idea of what your painting is going to be, but you can never achieve that. And it's only through the process of painting that your painting ends up being what the painting was going to be. And no matter how much you try to force it, it won't work if that's not what it's supposed to be. And that's life. Life can only be constructed through living it. The second of the three great existentialist thinkers in France after the war was a woman by the name of Simone de Beauvoir. And she most famously wrote The Second Sex, which we'll be reading sections of when we get to the feminist movement of the 1970s. It's a landmark book that was first published right after the war in France. And it was this dynamite understanding of gender and how gender is constructed in our society. That second bullet point there, one is not born a woman but becomes one, is the central thesis of the second half of her book. That is basically, or no, it's the first half of the book, how society has shaped you to be a woman, and there's no real concept of woman outside of society, because society has defined women as weak, as passive, as pretty, as all these things, which are not inherent in womanness, but are dependent upon male concepts of woman, because we live in a patriarchy. But anyway, she also talks about this idea that when an individual is kept in a situation of inferiority, the fact is that he does become inferior. That this was borne out by the success of the Nazis, who so insidiously made other people to be inferior, which then they became docile, inferior weaklings in the face of somebody proclaiming your authority over you. So she had a lot of really very interesting things to say, and we'll see her a little bit more later. And then the third of the holy trinity of existentialist thinkers, which is funny because they didn't believe in the Holy Trinity, is Albert Camus, who was a thinker and a writer, and who wrote a number of very popular novels. And one of the great quotes from Camus is, "Does the realization of the meaningless and absurdity of life necessarily require suicide?" And it's something to ponder. Once you realize that your whole life is worthless, then why live? That becomes the big existential question, the purpose of your being. Does the fact that there is no structure, higher power, meaning necessarily lead to the conclusion that your life is meaningless? And the answer is really no, because you can construct it. Once you work your way through it, you can embrace all these freedoms. You're free once you are no longer, uh, once you don't think like an oppressed person anymore. But our society doesn't value people who do that. In fact, our society institutionalizes people who do that. And you're met with all kinds of barriers to achieve that freedom. Anyway, you can see where existentialism can lead to this very dark place. And a lot of the artists in France after the war, their work spoke of this darkness, of this despair, of this alienation. And so that's what we typically think of when we think of expressionist artwork. We don't think of artists making it to the other side and embracing freedoms. When we think of it, existentialist art, we tend to think of some dark, brooding stuff. So be prepared for some sad looking art just for a little bit, okay? The artist that most people agree most fully embodies this sense of existential dread and alienation and estrangement is Alberto Giacometti. He's a Swiss artist, but he lived in France for a long time. And the works that he produced are these just kind of gripping, compelling, ugly, ugly works of people that are just alone, trapped within this space. Their faces are worked and worked and worked. They're ashen. They almost look as if they have been through a bombing themselves. There's a lot of detail paid to the darkening of the face, and then everything around them is just these paint strokes that blend into nothingness. The works that he does after the war, at least on two dimensions, well, in three dimensions too, are very similar. They repeat this theme over and over and over again. And the thing that's even more interesting about it is the models that sit for him are mostly family members. These are people that he's supposed to be close to, that he has bonds of affection for, and yet you would never know it by looking at these portraits where they are just sitting ramrod straight, their backs, their spines straight up. They look out at you, but kind of they don't engage with you. It's just this interiority that he's captured of these sitters. They're not engaging. Giacometti is mostly known as a sculptor, and before the war, he was associated with Surrealism. And he made works that are sort of typical of Surrealist concerns, thinking about sexuality, thinking about violence in some cases. So on the left, you've got one of his sculptures known as The Couple. So maleness, femaleness, the relationship between the two, the impossibility of the two. And then 1932, one of his most famous works, and one that the Surrealists loved, titled Woman with Her Throat Cut. And you can sort of see this vaguely feminine form, and then this sort of jagged edge as if there's a mouth or teeth or something like that. But after the war, he does these images of solitude, despair. The longer you look at them, the more depressed you look. And often they're self-portraits. You know, they're not just family and friends. He'll do self-portraits with, himself making the same position, being in the same position as some of these other people he depicts. And you can see why he is the king of existential art, because this sense of being alone and despairing and isolated and trapped even just pervades all of this work. Do you feel the despair yet? His sculptural work is eerily similar to his two-dimensional work. So even though you've got this figure that exists in real space and is engaged with you because it operates in your space, it's still isolated. It's still inward looking rather than outward looking. Talk about isolated despair. Look at this. It's just a head on a stick and it's just staring straight ahead. Its mouth is opened as if it's in the midst of this existential cry. Why? What's there in the universe? I'm trapped in myself. Help. Known for these long, thin, attenuated figures that usually stand on a base by themselves. Sometimes you'll see them with others, but each figure is this just incredibly thin, emaciated figure that again is sort of encrusted and it seems as if it's been incinerated. Some people have described them as Holocaust victims, people who were found in the concentration camps. It's this kind of incinerated individual. And somebody once said, if existentialism was a brand, a Giacometti stick figure would be on the t-shirt. It's so true because it just embodies that sense. And then he also continues to do like single body parts, just like the head we just saw. For example, this hand that seems to just be reaching out, this arm that's reaching out, trying to make contact, hoping for something. You see in this other stick figure on the left that this guy's hand is pointing and it's out. What's he pointing at? It's just this kind of existential cry for help or for trying to reach out, but you only have yourself. Two more, one figure on the right who's walking forward. At least he seems to be doing something. But then the figure on the left is tripping, which is so typical because that's what we do as humans. We trip, we fall. And what you have to do is you have to get yourself back up. You have to create your reality. So, you can't depend on anybody except for yourself. So when you fall, dust yourself off and get back up again and keep on walking. As I said, he does do figures that share a base. This is actually small. It's meant to be on a tabletop. And you've got these five figures who are all on a base, but you look at them, they're not paying attention to each other. They are in their own world. They're not engaged with one another. They're five figures, but they're still isolated. They're not in any kind of communal grouping. They're not reaching out to each other. And it's just like us, we might all share a classroom or a school or a state or a family, but we are all alone. Here's another isolated grouping of individuals on the right. And then here, this head that just dangles, it just hangs there with this beak-like nose. Is it Pinocchio? Has he been lying? He's in this constructed frame that Giacometti's made, almost like some of the rooms that he paints those individuals in, trapped by the room, just as this figure here is trapped by this literal cage, except for his beak sticks out. So once you've seen a Giacometti, they're easy to identify. You'll find them in museums all over the world because they really struck a chord with people at the end of World War II. This is how people felt. This is why members of the Gutai were reaching out to form communities, to form an international community. They didn't buy into this existential aloneness, this solitude, but Giacometti certainly did. The other great sculptor working in France after the war was a woman by the name of Germaine Richier, and her work is somewhat similar to Giacometti's in a certain way. They knew each other. They weren't close, but you can see some influences of Giacometti perhaps, and the tiny thin legs of the seated figure on the left. But Richier's work is much more inventive. She's interested in combining human and animal and insect forms in some works and creating these kind of grotesque creatures. And her work just got a little bit darker and darker after the war. This is two examples of it. The figure on the left, just this sort of vague seated woman who becomes a vessel, not no head or anything, or this crouching woman on the right where she is almost animal-like in the way her arms are out. She has this extension coming out of her rear end that looks like a tail, sort of. But again, her head is kind of deformed, and she is almost in the process of transforming from human to animal. She works in bronze like Giacometti did, and she gets it this patinated surface so that's black and gray. And again, here's two more figures, both males this time, and they're not heroic sculptures. They are almost everyday figures. They're kind of stout, and they're not necessarily heroic, muscular figures. They're instead kind of Homer Simpsons of the day, maybe kind of doofuses. Some of her most affecting works are ones like these, where the figure is engaged with this wire. And on the one hand, it's almost like the figures are playing with the wire, like it's almost like yarn toys that you might have, games that you might have played as a youngster, or a jump rope. But then it's more like they're also tethered by these ropes that are keeping them down, by these wires that anchor them. And an interpretation of these could be just the struggles that we have with those things that keep us from our freedom, those, things like religion, things like the state. And Richier does a number of these figures that have this conundrum of being trapped, maybe like trapped in a spider's web or something like that. And the figures themselves are kind of insect-like, and they're not fully human. So again, that kind of insect uh, metaphor caught in a web of, again, religion or something like that is an effective metaphor as well. Unlike Giacometti's work, figures do engage with each other in some instances. In the work of Richier, here you've got this figure on the left who seems to be taking his buffalo skull out for a walk, maybe a deformed figure on the right who seems to be engaged with an even further deformed figure. Is it a bird? Is it an animal? Is it an insect? It's so hard to tell. Are they fighting? Is it play? On the right is another angle of the crouching woman that I showed you earlier. But then on the left is a like praying mantis figure that she does later. And you can see how the crouch is kind of the same and the posture is kind of the same. And here the praying mantis is looking to devour an insect, or perhaps looking to devour its mate. And then so it lends that kind of aggressive aspect to the woman that is in a similar position and a similar pose on the right. After the war, Richier's figures became more and more grotesque figures, uh, really stretching the line between human and animal and insect and something else entirely, alien, maybe. Some of them break up, like you have this female figure on the right with her head cleaved in two. And others them just seem as if they are again kind of in the stage of transformation, like this egg figure. Is this person hatching from this egg, or what exactly is the condition? There's a certain whimsical quality to a lot of her work, I think, but at the same time as these are whimsical, there's also something threatening to them as well, or almost like they've been victimized too. It's hard to put your finger on it. So they're a lot more evocative, and they engage your imagination a lot more than maybe Giacometti's do, because Giacometti's all follow the same kind of pattern. Once you see one Giacometti, you kind of seen them all. But Richier is always creating these new creatures, these new hybrids that really take you by surprise. A painter who's closely related to existential thought and ideas is Jean Fautrier. And Fautrier is an artist who also focuses on lone individuals who are kind of incomplete or who seem to be missing parts, as you can see in these two particular works. But it was a series he began in 1945 after the war that really cements his reputation as a painter of kind of expressionist anxiety. And that's when he began this Head of a Hostage series that he did, and it relates to his experiences during the war. At one point, he was arrested by the Gestapo in Paris, and although he was ultimately released after a period of time in jail, he decided he was going to get out of Paris and go into hiding. So he went to the countryside, and unfortunately, after he had gone into this retreat, this place that he was hiding in the country, the Germans came and they set up an encampment in the woods surrounding this farmhouse where he was. And it was in this place that they captured French citizens and tortured them. And Fautrier heard the screams of the people as they were being tortured and then killed by the Nazis. And it was a horrifying experience for him because he didn't dare leave where he was staying. He feared that he would be arrested. He feared that he would get tortured and killed, and so he had to just stay there and listen to this for days on end. The screams of agony as somebody's having unspeakable things done to them. And after the war, he kind of conceptualized this experience in these series of paintings of these discombobulated heads that have kind of just the bare rudimentary traces of a face. Sometimes he built up his paint so it was very thick and ends up cracking in some instances. And he makes this experience of torture almost like the ultimate individual experience, because of course nobody can experience your pain except you, and it's not transferable. Nobody gets it except for you. And here these heads are that are mangled and almost beyond recognition, and he kind of distills this experience into these misshapen heads. He makes a great many of these heads of hostages, and it's almost as if he's working out his own experiences, his own anxiety, his own fears, his own torture in these heads as he tries to come to terms and to come to grips with not only what he experienced, but what they experienced and what the world has experienced under this brutal regime. Finally, two more. Francis Gruber was a French painter who was friends with Giacometti, and these are all paintings that he did in the 1940s. He died in 1948 at the young age of 36 when he contracted tuberculosis, and so he didn't live very long after the war, but his paintings during it and in the 3 years after the war, really expressed this idea of the alienation and the despair and the dysfunction and just depression of a thinking person during these times. Again, like Giacometti, these figures are just utterly and totally alone. They're not expressing the same type of anguish as the heads of the hostages that Fautrier was painting, but For a realist painter, and Francis Gruber really was never attracted to abstraction in the way that Fautrier was, he really still is able to capture this type of just overwhelming incapacitation. The figures lean on things, they look away, they lie on beds or couches, and their nudity expresses their uh, not so much their sexuality, but expresses just their utter nakedness before the sheer terror of humanity and of existence. Whether inside or outside, there's a bleakness to the outlook of Francis Gruber that is really so well expressed by these figures that just can't find a way out. They're just in like the most utter of funks, these people of Francis Gruber. It's kind of heartbreaking. But that really is the human condition. This is how we all are, ultimately. And it's better to accept this and to realize it and then to find your freedom than to just let the isolation and despair consume you. The case of Jean Hélion is really interesting because he's one of these artists in the 1930s who was affiliated with geometric abstraction and was one of the best known in France at the time because he was quite successful in creating these really beautiful, colorful compositions that have a certain appeal to them. They're just visually almost soothing and relaxing. But after the war, he made a dramatic switch, going from that type of geometric abstraction to painting these nudes of women who are just desolate and isolated and depressed, and it looks like they stepped out of a Francis Gruber painting, except he paints it in this really stark, cartoony style, which was just a shock to people to see this movement from geometric abstraction to cartoony nudity in the work of Jean Hélion. He would influence a whole bunch of people when he did this, later artists. Probably the best well known is Roy Lichtenstein in the United States, who himself will look to comics and comic strips as his inspiration in about 10 years or 15 years after Jean Hélion does this. He doesn't paint in this cartoon style for long, just until about the mid 50s, and then he switches again to a brand of realism that looks more like real life than these cartoons. But for about, I don't know, 10 years or so, this is the style that is associated with Hélion, and it's the subject matter that's particularly associated with existentialism, as once again you see these figures alone, naked, in front of an unforgiving world. Here's two more in that same vein. I know the work on the left looks a whole lot like the work on the right in the previous slide, but they're actually different paintings of these despondent, naked women. Hélion was also interested in depicting store windows that have displays in them, particularly at a time when France was undergoing this severe economic depression, a downturn. People weren't able to buy things, and yet there was still the hope of shopkeepers that people would come in and spend money. So Hélion found this sort of interesting contrast between what was behind the glass and what was happening in the street. So on the left, you've got just this umbrella that somebody's abandoned. On the right, you've got a man that somebody's abandoned. He's got one shoe on and one shoe off. He's clearly a homeless guy. And the mannequins in the background are almost responding to him. They're almost like they're making commentary. The mannequins on the left are kind of disassembled themselves. So they're kind of human but not human, and so it makes this interesting commentary on people's realities. Like Giacometti's sculptures that share a base, when there are multiple people in an Hélion painting at this time, they all kind of ignore each other. these men in the park who are reading their newspapers and not at all being social with one another, just absorbed in their own world, just as ultimately we all are. Or this man in the street who's fallen. You see, he's seated on the ground. His hat is behind him. He's looking to this man for aid or comfort or something, and the man is just looking at his newspaper. Meanwhile, another bicyclist, you know, rides by. And this idea of a fallen person, he does a couple other paintings of fallen people in the street, and it can relate to the tripping figure in Giacometti's sculpture, this idea that we fall and we're the ones who have to get ourselves up. We can't rely on anybody. Even the world's most famous artist before the war, Pablo Picasso, starts making works that are decidedly gloomy and bleak and in some ways hopeless, as his previously colorful canvases give way to grays, blacks, whites, and what you see appear throughout work after work after work is skulls, 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 skulls. So all this death and all these reminders of mortality, of course, are something that you might expect right after such a horrible conflict as World War II, and also Picasso had also experienced the Spanish Civil War, which ravaged his Spain in the 1930s, and so his outlook was decidedly pessimistic by this stage. And people have argued that he wasn't necessarily an existentialist, but he did socialize with Sartre and Camus and knew them. We assume he read their books, and I think this was more like a flirtation with existentialism. He certainly is somebody who believed in robustly living one's life and doing it according to your own rules. Don't follow other people's rules. And he'd always lived that way. And so, in a way, Pablo Picasso lived the life of an existentialist who rejected country, rejected religion, rejected all these things, and lived a life that was pretty much devoted to himself. Bulls are an enduring theme throughout a lot of Pablo Picasso's many different styles and periods through his life. But here during this one, they appear, but again, they're skulls. They're not the vibrant forces for life and for sex and macho qualities that they are in other Picasso works. And here are two last skull pictures by Picasso. And with these, I want to end this existentialism conversation and look at what other artists did in response to the war, in response to American painting, and in response to existentialism even. So it's this turn towards abstraction, a rejection of depictions of the real world, and it's something that a whole bunch of artists really joined the bandwagon throughout the late 40s, 50s, 60s, and into the 1970s in Europe. One of the problems with painting in the post-war years after World War II and before the 1960s or 1970s is that there's not really a good term to call it. It wasn't one consolidated group like you had in America with the abstract expressionists. Instead, a lot of different Europeans seemed to express this idea of just moving towards a general abstraction, a general expressionism, and a lot of them came to France, and there was probably the most concerted group effort in France, but it doesn't it lacks the name. Lyrical abstraction is one of the things it's called. Taschism is another. Art informal is another, and so needed better branding, I guess. But it it was something that has similarities to abstract expressionism. Certain of the artists became proponents of different types of paintings and developed their own idiosyncratic, personalized painting style that they kept doing that was similar to the way individual artists in the United States did. Like Mark Rothko is known for his color filled paintings, and Barnett Newman is known for his zip paintings. And there are certain similarities here with certain artists who embody a specific type of aesthetic or a specific type of look of painting. Many of these artists are not well known in the United States. They're much better known in Europe. But within the past 15, 20 years, more and more you start seeing exhibitions of their work in the US. And also, Milwaukee Art Museum has a collection of some really good lyrical abstractions. So if you get to Milwaukee, up on the second floor above the contemporary art in the modern area, you'll find a number of really fantastic mid-century European painters like Georges Mathieu, whose work is very aggressive and slashing and um, piercing. Generally, the description of lyrical abstraction is that it's not as aggressive as abstract expressionism. It's not as unbridled and passionate and raw. There's something a little fussy about it to Americanize. And whether that's true or that's just reflecting like ethnocentric viewpoints of European painting versus American painting, I think, if you compare Pierre Soulages, whose work is awful lot like Franz Klein, you see that Pierre Soulages is a little bit more refined. It's a little bit less full of action. And he really stuck to this very distinctive style of painting with these big black slashes, although he incorporated more color, just like Franz Klein was doing before he died. Like Francis Gruber, Voles died when he was only 38, so a very young age. But before he did, in 1951, he was considered a leader of the movement of lyrical abstraction. Voles is a pseudonym after he rejected the German name that he was born with after the horrors of Germany in World War II. And his works was kind of influenced by surrealism. Some of his lyrical abstract works are considered to be abstractions of the mind, like you're going inside the human mind or the psyche or the unconscious mind. And you can see that in the works he drips and he splashes, and these are relatively small paintings. I mean, he never did huge paintings, but he was considered a leader of this movement. They also have a lot of similarities with Fautrier's work, and so sometimes Voles is discussed as an existentialist because there's a focus almost on the individual here. Each of these abstractions kind of has this dark center place that you could read an abstract individual to, and then kind of interpret it from there. There were artists from all over the world, like I said, in France after the war, who took part in this movement. We've got Voles from Germany. We've got Zhao Wu Qi was Chinese, who came to Paris and became part of the art scene, developing this form of abstraction there while he was there in the 30s and into the 40s and 50s even. And his works are almost abstract landscapes. There's a real kind of landscape feel to them. If you know the works of the 19th century artist William Turner, the British artist, there's something almost Turneresque about some of these works that Zhao Wu Qi did. Zhao Wu Qi was something of a world traveler. A citizen of the world, maybe you could call him. He traveled to Europe and then he would return to China for long periods of time, and then he would go and move to different places and spend decades of his life. So he was kind of a traveling missionary for lyrical abstraction wherever he went. Maria Helena Vieira da Silva was Portuguese and one of the few women associated with this group, although perhaps more will come to light, just as more women have come to light associated with abstract expressionism. Her works are really very dense and packed with lots of different geometric linear forms. They look almost like interiors of buildings or sometimes like the structures of buildings. In that sense, there's a certain relationship between her work and the work of um, head astern, except for Vieira da Silva's works are much more densely packed with all kinds of crisscrossing lines and densities of geometric forms. Nicholas de Stael was originally born in Russia, but his family fled the Russian Revolution in 1917 and ended up in Belgium, and then he later ended up in France as an adult, where he became a stalwart member of this lyrical abstraction crew, painting images like this with these blocky, rectangular brush strokes that again kind of make you think of landscapes in a way, but are also distinctly unique and very much his own style. There's also something that's kind of map-like with his works, as these blocks almost seem to be like plots of land, or different countries or states or something like that. Jean-Michel Coulon is an interesting figure because he exhibited with some of these lyrical abstractionists early on in the late 40s, early 1950s, and then he kind of disappeared from the gallery scene, from the art scene. People assumed he had stopped painting and turned to other interests, but in fact, he continued to paint. He just didn't want to show his works, and he didn't want to talk about his works, and he didn't want people to see his works. And so when he died, his family discovered that he had like over 1,000 different paintings that he had done throughout his life that had all been kept in a storage unit and studio that he had. And these are the types of works that he did. They're very interesting. They're kind of, they look like bookshelves in a way. There's, again, these blocky uh, areas of color that look as if they are some form of writing, maybe. Here's two more of these paintings that Coulon did in secret. He also did a number of very interesting collages where he cut and tore the paper, oftentimes in these same configurations as these little almost post-it note like scraps, which then he put together on surfaces. Very intriguing guy. Hans Hartung was a German who was considered a degenerate by the Nazi regime when it came to power, because he was a painter who painted in a modern style. So he fled Germany and went to France, where he had studied earlier in his life. He then joined the French Foreign Legion and fought for France against Germany in the war, and ultimately lost a leg in North Africa. When he returned, he painted in what's considered to be a gestural style. But if you think of gestural style, you think of Pollock or you think of Willem de Kooning. And there's something so elegant and so beautiful about Hans Hartung's lines. They are just so straight, and they have so much grace. They fly off the page in an interesting way, and they're so much more refined than anything done in the United States. They're just lyrical and beautiful. And he also painted them in a very large scale, room size, like some of the largest Jackson Pollocks. And so you've got these long horizontal that almost reads like water or light shimmering on a surface. They're quite captivating. Probably one of my favorites of these European artists. Here's the final two of Hartung's gestural abstractions. He was also a printmaker and does beautiful prints, just gorgeous. As a lot of these guys did. Pierre Soulages, I think his prints are better than his paintings, actually. But yeah, so that's lyrical abstraction. Generally, they're considered to be more tame, more civilized, more refined, more lyrical, as the name might suggest, than the aggression that you see in America. Again, is that true? Is that something that we make up? I don't know. You certainly can see the refinement in something like Hartung's work, I think. One final French artist before we leave France, and that is Jean Dubuffet. And Jean Dubuffet isn't really associated with any particular school or aligned with any form of philosophical thought. He coined the term art brut, and it is sort of been translated as raw art or outsider art. And it's because he was always an artist fascinated by the art produced by non-professional artists. So he was fascinated by folk artists who'd never taken out the class before. He was fascinated by children's art, especially. And in some of Dubufay's early works, like these, you can see it looks like he's a child. These have this childlike graphic quality that is very hard to miss. He also was interested in the art of the people who had been institutionalized and were considered insane at the time, people whose own inner visions kind of led them to draw their own interior worlds. But children's art is where it all began for him and what he would remain interested in throughout his life. And he really became a proponent for a child's imagination and for adults trying to get back to their own interior child, to kind of forget what they had learned in art school and to express themselves with the same rawness and the same intensity that children are able to do. And it was his lifelong goal to try to achieve that. Here's two more works by Jean Dubuffet, attempting to present the world as if through a child's eyes, whether it's a nude woman on a couch or a woman giving birth in the hospital on the left. Dubuffet collected children's art, and he collected art of non-professional artists. He had a large collection, especially of children's art, which is something that he collected all his life. And again, he looked to them as important sources. So here on the left is a painting of Dubuffet by Dubuffet, and then on the right is just a collection of some of the portraits done by children that were in his own collection. Dubuffet is not the first artist to do this. If you took modern art and you think back to the work of Gabrielle Munter, who collected children's art and really looked at it as an inspiration for her own art, or later on, Paul Klee also was an important advocate of the child's innocent vision. And here, Dubuffet is kind of picking up that baton and taking it further into the 20th century. In 1945, he saw an exhibition of Jean Fautrier's paintings, his early heads of hostages that he did, and the surface of them that were so worked up, had such thick paint, really impressed him and inspired him to move into a more textural form of painting. So what Dubuffet started doing is mixing his paintings with all kinds of different substances, from sand to dirt to tar, even whatever he could find, he used to create these heavy textured surfaces. Still, the works that he did were very much based on a child's aesthetic. He focused on the human body mostly during this period in the 40s and 50s. And he frequently made these very large figures that are just massive. They fill up the entire canvas with their massive bodies, and they're really quite intense. Two more of these kind of monstrous female figures in this case. He also, when he would make textured paintings, and he varied his production, so sometimes painted sort of flat like you see on the left, and sometimes they're heavily textured with sand and dirt. But when he had a lot of texture, he would often then carve into the surface as well, so it becomes sculptural even more than before. They become almost like relief carvings. Here's two more, very similar in layout and design. He was a sculptor, he was a painter, he was a printmaker. These are two lithographs that he does with this same aesthetic. He was also fascinated by collage. These are a couple of butterfly wing collages that he did using actual butterfly wings. And you can see how somebody like Alfonso Osorio, who we talked about with abstract expressionism, would have just been fascinated by Dubuffet and why Osorio went and visited with him, why he promoted his work, why he purchased his work. He was fascinated by Dubuffet, and Dubuffet opened up a whole new world for Alfonso Osorio. The next four sets of slides are just an assortment of these characters, these figures that Dubuffet created. And a lot of them, in their solitude and in their uniqueness, have been linked to existentialism as well. You know, here you are sort of trapped in your world and shaped by the forces of your own life experiences. And this is often rooted in childhood, so people can make connections between existentialism and Dubuffet's work before they can and they have before. I'll just be quiet for the next 3 slides. Okay, just look at these cool people. He didn't only create single figures, though. He did a number of compositions where these works where they are set in a cityscape, and they're dense and they're packed, and there's this wonderful childlike sense of perspective, and they're just sometimes they're labeled like you see here, and they're just full of things to look at and to observe and to see. In the 1960s, his style changed and they became much more graphic, kind of like Jean Helion when he switched in the 40s to this cartoony style. And this is what Dubuffet does later on, and they're almost like puzzle pieces. Here's a print in this style on the left by Dubuffet, and a painting over on the right. He kind of embraces this cartoon abstraction. And there are sculptures done in these style as well that look like big plastic puzzle pieces. And here's a couple of those sculptures. They could be figurative, like the work on the left, or more abstract, like the image on the right. So he had an enormous influence on many people. Actually, he helped to promote the collection of outsider art and the growth of that field as a field of study and a field of collection. And that was something that caught on both in Europe as well as in the United States. So Dubuffet, interesting French character. So we'll stop there with this PowerPoint. We'll turn our attention to, very briefly, we're going to look at Italy and Amsterdam because there were some interesting different things going on there. And then there will be another PowerPoint that focuses only on England and the British Isles.